The Little Shepherd of Kingdom Come by John Fox Jr., Chapter 3, Part 2. "Take good care of Lizzie," said the mother from the porch kindly, and Chad, curiously touched all at once by the trust shown him, stalked ahead like a little savage, while Melissa, with her basket, followed silently behind. The boy never thought of taking the basket himself. That is not the way of the men with women in the hills. And not once did he look around or speak on the way up the river and past the blacksmith shop and the grist mill just beyond the mouth of Kingdom Come. But when they arrived at the log schoolhouse, it was his turn to be shy, and he hung back to let Melissa go in first. Within, there was no floor but the bare earth, no window but the cracks between the logs, and no desks but the flat sides of slabs held up by wobbling pegs. On one side were girls in linsey and homespun, some thin, undersized, underfed, and with weak, dispirited eyes and yellow, tousled hair. Others round-faced, round-eyed, dark, and sturdy, most of them large-waisted and round-shouldered, especially the older ones, from work in the fields. But now and then one like Melissa, the daughter of a valley farmer, erect, agile, spirited, and intelligent. On the other side were the boys, in physical characteristics the same and suggesting the same social divisions. At the top, the farmer, now and then a slaveholder, and perhaps of gentle blood, who had dropped by the way on the westward march of civilization and had cleared some rich river bottom and a neighboring summit of the mountains, where he set his sheep and cattle to graze. Where a creek opened into this valley, some free settler whose grandfather had fought at King's Mountain, usually of Scotch-Irish descent, often English, but sometimes German or sometimes even French Huguenot, who would have his rude home of logs under him and in wretched cabins at the head of the creek or on the washed spur of the mountain above, or in some deadening still higher up and swept by mists and low-trailing clouds, the poor white trash, worthless descendants of the servile and sometimes criminal class, who might have traced their origin back to the slums of London, hand-to-mouth tenants of the valley aristocrat, hewers of wood for him in the lowlands and upland guardians of his cattle and sheep. And finally, walking up and down the earth floor, stern and smooth of face and of a preternatural dignity hardly to be found elsewhere, the mountain schoolmaster. It was a blab school, as the mountaineers characterize a school in which the pupils study aloud, and the droning chorus, as shrill as locust cries, ceased suddenly when Chad came in. And every eye was turned on him with a sexless gaze of curiosity that made his face redden and his heart throb. But he forgot them when the schoolmaster pierced him with eyes that seemed to shoot from under his heavy brows like a strong light from deep darkness. Chad met them, nor did his chin droop, and Caleb Hazel saw that the boy's face was frank and honest, and that his eye was fearless and kind. And without question he motioned to a seat with one wave of his hand, setting Chad on the corner of a slab, and the studious drone to vibrating again. When the boy ventured to glance around, he saw Dawes Dillon in one corner making a face at him, and little Tad scowling from behind a book. And on the other side, among the girls, he saw another hostile face next little Melissa, which had the pointed chin and the narrow eyes of the Dillon breed, as old Joel called the family, whose farm was at the mouth of Kingdom Come, and whose boundary touched his own. When the first morning recess came, little recess, as it was called, the master kept Chad in and asked him his name, if he had ever been to school, and whether he knew his ABCs, and he showed no surprise when Chad without shame told him no. So the master got Melissa's spelling book and pointed out the first 7 letters of the alphabet and made Chad repeat them 3 times, watching the boy's earnest, wrinkling brow closely and with growing interest. When school took up again, Chad was told to say them aloud in concert with the others, which he did, until he could repeat them without looking at his book. And the master saw him thus saying them, while his eyes roved around the room, and he nodded to himself with satisfaction, for he was accustomed to visible communion with himself in school and out. At noon, called Big Recess, Melissa gave Chad some cornbread and bacon, and the boys gathered around him while the girls looked at him curiously, merely because he was a stranger, and some of them, especially the Dillon girl, whispered, and Chad blushed and was uncomfortable. For once the Dillon girl laughed unkindly. The boys had no games, but they jumped and threw rocks with great accuracy at a little birch tree, and Dawes and Tad always spat on their stones and pointed with the forefinger of the left hand first at what they were going to throw at, while Chad sat to one side and took no part, though he longed to show them what he could do. By and by they fell to wrestling, and finally Tad bantered him for a trial. Chad hesitated, and his late enemy misunderstood. "I'll give you both underholts again," he said loftily. "You're afeard." This was too much, and Chad sprang to his feet and grappled, disdaining the proffered advantage, and got hurled to the ground, his head striking the earth violently and making him so dizzy that the brave smile with which he took his fall looked rather sickly and pathetic. "Yes, and Whizzer can whoop your dog too," said Tad, and Chad saw that he was going to have trouble with those Dillons, for Dawes winked at the other boys, and the Dillon girl laughed again scornfully, at which Chad saw Melissa's eyes flash and her hands clench, as quite unconsciously she moved toward him to take his part. And all at once he was glad that he had nobody else to champion him. "You wouldn't dare touch him if one of my brothers was here," she said indignantly. "And don't you dare touch him again, Tad Dillon. And you," she said witheringly. "You," she repeated, and stopped helplessly for the want of words, but her eyes spoke with the fierce authority of the Turner clan and its dominant power for half a century, and Nancy Dillon shrank, though she turned and made a spiteful face when Melissa walked toward the schoolhouse alone. That afternoon was the longest of Chad's life. It seemed as though it would never come to an end, for Chad had never sat so still for so long. His throat got dry, repeating the dreary round of letters over and over, and his head ached, and he fidgeted in his chair while the slow hours passed and the sun went down behind the mountain and left the schoolhouse in rapidly cooling shadow. His heart leaped when the last class was heard and the signal was given that meant freedom for the little prisoners. But Melissa sat pouting in her seat. She'd missed her lesson and must be kept in for a while. So Chad, too, kept his seat, and the master heard him say his letters without the book and nodded his head as though to say to himself that such quickness was exactly what he had looked for. By the time Chad had learned down to the letter O, Melissa was ready, for she was quick too, and it was her anger that made her miss. And the two started home, Chad stalking ahead once more. To save him, he could not say a word of thanks, but how he wished that a bear or a wildcat would spring into the road. He would fight it with teeth and naked hands to show her how he felt and to save her from harm. The sunlight still lay warm and yellow far under the crest of the pine mountain, and they had not gone far when Caleb Hazel overtook them, with long strides forged ahead. The schoolmaster boarded around, and it was his week with the Turners, and Chad was glad, for he already loved the tall, gaunt, awkward man who asked him question after question so kindly, loved him as much as he revered and feared him, and the boy's artless, sturdy answers in turn pleased Caleb Hazel. And when Chad told who had given him Jack, the master began to talk about the faraway, curious country of which the cattle dealer had told Chad so much, where the land was level and there were no mountains at all, where on one farm might be more sheep and cattle and slaves than Chad had seen in all his life, where the people lived in big houses of stone and brick. What brick was Chad could not imagine. And they rode along hard white roads in shiny covered wagons with two black folks on a high seat in front of one little black kid behind to open the gates, and were proud and very high-heeled indeed, where there were towns that had more people than a whole county in the mountains, with rock roads running through them in every direction and narrow rock paths along these roads like rows of hearthstones for the people to walk on. The land of the bluegrass, the settlements of old Cane Tuck. And there were churches everywhere as tall as trees, and schoolhouses aplenty, and big schools called colleges to which the boys went when they were through with the little schools. The master had gone to one of these colleges for a year, and he was trying to make money enough to go again. And Chad must go someday too. There was no reason why he shouldn't, since any boy could do anything he pleased if he only made up his mind and worked hard and never gave up. The master was an orphan too, he said with a slow smile. He had been an orphan for a long while, and indeed the lonely struggle of his own boyhood was what was helping to draw him to Chad. This college, he said, was a huge brown house as big as a cliff that the master pointed out, that gray and solemn towered high above the river, and with a rock porch bigger than a great boulder that hung just under the cliff, with 20 long, long stone steps to climb before one came to the big double front door. "How do you get there?" Chad asked so breathlessly that Melissa looked quickly up with a sudden foreboding that she might lose her little playfellow someday. The master had walked, and it took him a week. A good horse could make the trip in 4 days, and the rivermen floated logs down the river to the capital in 8 or 10 days, according to the tide. When did they go? In the spring, when the tides came. The Turners went down, didn't they, Melissa? And Melissa said that her brother Tom had made one trip, and that Dolph and Rube were might nigh crazy to go that coming spring, and thereupon a mighty resolution filled Chad's heart to the brim and steadied his eyes, but he did not open his lips then. Dusk was settling when the Turner cabin came in sight. None of the men folks had come home yet, and the mother was worried. There was wood to cut and the cows to milk, and Chad's friend, old Betsy the Brindle, had strayed off again, but she was glad to see Caleb Hazel, who without a word went out to the woodpile, took off his coat, and swung the axe with mighty arms, while Chad carried in the wood and piled it in the kitchen, and then the two went after the old Brindle together. When they got back, there was a great tumult in the cabin. Tom had brought some friends from over the mountain and had told the neighbors as he came along that there was going to be a party at the house that night. So there was a great bustle about the barn where Rube was getting the stock fed and the milking done, and around the kitchen where Dolph was cutting more wood and piling it up at the door. Inside, the mother was hurrying up supper with Cynthia, an older daughter, who had just come home from a visit, and Melissa helping her, while old Joel sat by the fire in the sleeping room and smoked, with Jack lying on the hearth or anywhere he pleased, for Jack, with his gentle ways, was winning the household one by one. He sprang up when he heard Chad's voice and flew at him, jumping up and pawing him affectionately and licking his face while Chad hugged him and talked to him as though he were human and a brother. Never before had the two been separated for a day. So while the master helped Rube at the barn and Chad helped Dolph at the woodpile, Jack hung about his master, tired and hungry as he was, and much as he wanted to be by the fire or waiting in the kitchen for a sly bit from Melissa, whom he knew at once as the best of his new friends. After supper, Dolph got out his banjo and played Shady Grove and Blind Coon Dog and Sugar Hill and Gambling Man, while Chad's eyes glistened and his feet shuffled under his chair. And when Dolph put the rude thing down on the bed and went into the kitchen, Chad edged toward it, and while old Joel was bragging about Jack to the schoolmaster, he took hold of it with trembling fingers and touched the strings timidly. Then he looked around cautiously. Nobody was paying any attention to him, and he took it up into his lap and began to pick, ever so softly. Nobody saw him but Melissa, who slipped quietly to the back of the room and drew near him. Softly and swiftly Chad's fingers worked, and Melissa could scarcely hear the sound of the banjo under her father's loud voice, but she could make out that he was playing a tune that still vibrates unceasingly from the Pennsylvania border to the pine-covered hills of Georgia, Sourwood Mountain. Melissa held her breath while she listened. Dolph could not play like that, and by and by she slipped quietly to her father and pulled his sleeve and pointed to Chad. Old Joel stopped talking, but Chad never noticed. His head was bent over the neck of the banjo. His body was swaying rhythmically. His chubby fingers were going like lightning, and his eyes were closed. The boy was fairly lost to the world. The tune came out in the sudden silence, clean cut and swinging. Hee-ho-de-hum, dee-diddly-doo-dah, rang the strings, and old Joel's eyes danced. "Sing it, boy," he roared, "sing it." And Chad sprang from the bed, on fire with confusion and twisting his fingers helplessly. He looked almost frightened when Dolph ran back into the room and cried, "Who was that a-picking that banjo?" It was not often that Dolph showed excitement, but he had good cause, and when he saw Chad standing shamefaced and bashful in the middle of the floor and Melissa joyously pointing her finger at him, he caught up the banjo from the bed and put it into the boy's hands. "Here, you just play that tune again." Chad shrank back, half distressed and half happy, and only a hail outside from the first of the coming guests saved him from utter confusion. Once started, they came swiftly, and in a half hour all were there. Each got a hearty welcome from old Joel, who with a wink and a laugh and a nod to the old mother gave a hearty squeeze to some buxom girl, while the fire roared a heavier welcome still. Then was there a dance indeed, no soft swish of lace and muslin, but the active swing of linsey and simple homespun. No French fiddlers' bows and scrapings, no intricate lancers, no languid waltz, but neat shuffling, forward and back with every note of the music beat. Floor-thumping cuttings of the pigeon's wing and jolly jigs 2 by 2, and a great swinging of corners, and caging the bird, and first lady to the right cheat and swing. No flirting from behind fans and under stairways and little nooks, but honest open courtship, strong arms about healthy waists, and a kiss taken now and then, with everybody to see and nobody to care who saw. If a chair was lacking, a pair of brawny knees made one chair serve for two, but never, if you please, for two men. Rude, rough, semi-barbarous, if you will, but simple, natural, honest, sane, earthy, and of the earth whence springs the oak, in time may be the flower of civilization. End of Chapter 3, Part 2.